Tonight, America is watching something unfold that should terrify anyone who still believes the justice system is supposed to be independent from political power. Because what started as another routine court hearing suddenly exploded into a scandal that is now threatening to engulf the highest levels of the federal government. And here is the shocking part. It is not the political opposition making these accusations. It is federal judges. It is government lawyers. It is the administration's own people admitting in court that something went very wrong behind the scenes. In Rhode Island, a federal courtroom turned into a public humiliation for the Department of Justice. A government attorney stood before a judge and essentially confessed that critical information had been deliberately withheld from the court. Not accidentally. Not because of confusion. Deliberately. According to testimony inside that courtroom, Homeland Security officials allegedly instructed DOJ lawyers not to fully cooperate with the judge. And when the administration later issued a public statement attacking that same judge, the statement reportedly contained claims that were completely false. Now think about how extraordinary this is. A presidential administration openly attacking a federal judge is already explosive enough. But being accused of lying about that judge while simultaneously withholding evidence from the court, that crosses into territory that even longtime Washington insiders are struggling to explain away. The DOJ lawyer reportedly apologized over and over in court, practically begging the judge not to pursue sanctions. But the damage may already be done. The judge is now weighing contempt charges against officials from both the Justice Department and Homeland Security. Contempt of court. That is not a cable news talking point. That is the kind of phrase that can destroy careers, end law licenses, and trigger massive constitutional battles. But here is the real question. Why would government officials risk all of that? Critics believe the answer is becoming painfully obvious. This administration is no longer treating the courts as a co-equal branch of government. It is treating them like obstacles to crush, manipulate, or bypass whenever they become inconvenient. And if that sounds dramatic, what happened in Alabama may be even worse. Because now another federal judge is reviewing allegations that DOJ lawyers may have misled a grand jury in a high-profile prosecution involving the Southern Poverty Law Center. And if those accusations prove true, the consequences could be catastrophic. The SPLC's legal team has taken the extraordinary step of demanding access to secret grand jury transcripts. That almost never happens. Grand jury proceedings are among the most protected parts of the American legal system. So why would defense attorneys push for something this extreme? Because they appear to believe federal prosecutors may have presented false or misleading information in order to secure an indictment. Think about that for a second. If prosecutors manipulated a grand jury, the case could collapse instantly. But it would not stop there. Lawyers involved could face discipline, disbarment, or even criminal exposure themselves. This is the kind of scandal that normally ends presidencies. And yet somehow inside this administration, chaos like this has become almost routine. Every single week, another courtroom battle. Another emergency hearing. Another judge warning government officials that they may have crossed a legal line. And this is where things become even more dangerous politically. Because while these legal disasters pile up, public support is collapsing at the same time. New polling numbers are sending panic through Washington. Approval ratings are underwater across nearly every major issue. Inflation, cost of living, foreign policy, economic management. Americans are increasingly telling pollsters they do not trust the administration to handle even basic governance anymore. And honestly, after watching these courtroom disasters unfold, a lot of voters are beginning to ask the same question. If they cannot even tell the truth to a federal judge, how can the country trust them with anything else? But this was only the beginning. What happened next surprised even many longtime government officials. Because the crisis was no longer confined to courtrooms, legal filings, or political scandals in Washington. Americans across the country started feeling the consequences in real life. Not in theory, not in ideology, in real life. And suddenly people began realizing what happens when an administration starts tearing apart the machinery of government itself. Last month, violent tornadoes ripped through parts of Kansas, homes damaged, trees torn apart. Families scrambling for shelter as massive storms moved across the region. But something was missing. The warning system barely functioned. Normally, communities receive tornado watches hours before severe weather arrives. That time matters. It gives families time to prepare, schools time to react, emergency crews time to mobilize. This time, some residents reportedly received barely 30 minutes of notice before the storms hit. 30 minutes. And according to multiple reports, one major reason was because critical weather balloon launches simply never happened that morning. Why? Because staffing levels inside the National Weather Service had been slashed. Cuts, layoffs, budget reductions, departments hollowed out, and suddenly America discovered something painfully obvious. When you break the people responsible for forecasting disasters, the disasters do not stop coming. You just stop being prepared for them. This is the part politicians rarely talk about. Government is invisible when it works. But when it fails, everybody notices. And this administration has been leaving failure everywhere. At the Department of Agriculture, officials made what experts are calling one of the worst crop forecasting mistakes in recent memory. The government underestimated U.S. corn acreage by over 1 million acres. 1 million. That error sent shockwaves through commodity markets because farmers, traders, transport companies, and exporters all rely on those numbers to make billion-dollar decisions. Corn prices moved. Contracts shifted. Farmers lost leverage. Markets became unstable. And here is where things become shocking. The agency responsible for those reports had just been hit with massive staffing cuts. Thousands of federal employees gone. Entire divisions gutted, experienced analysts pushed out. The result? America's own government suddenly could not accurately measure its own food supply. Imagine hearing that 10 years ago. The richest country on earth. The largest agricultural power in the world. And its forecasting systems are suddenly malfunctioning because political appointees decided government expertise was disposable. Meanwhile, farmers were already being crushed from every direction. Fuel costs rising, fertilizer prices exploding, trade wars disrupting exports, equipment expenses skyrocketing. For many rural communities, this was supposed to be the administration that fought for them. That was the promise. But critics now argue many of those same communities are paying the price for policies that were sold as patriotic victories. And voters are starting to notice. Because once people feel instability in their wallets, at the gas station, at the grocery store, and during natural disasters, politics becomes personal very quickly. That is why the latest approval numbers are terrifying for the White House. The administration is now deeply underwater on inflation, underwater on cost of living, underwater on economic confidence. Millions of Americans no longer believe the people running the country actually know what they are doing. And maybe the most damaging part is this. The failures are no longer isolated. It is not just one scandal, not just one bad decision, not just one mistake. It is becoming a pattern. A government struggling to manage basic responsibilities while simultaneously fighting wars overseas, battling judges at home, and waging political warfare against its own institutions. And then things became international. Just as the administration was drowning in legal chaos and domestic failures, another crisis exploded overseas. And this one carried the kind of risk that can change the course of history. Because tensions with Iran were no longer simmering quietly in the background, the situation had become dangerously real. Reports of direct confrontations involving American and Iranian forces in the Strait of Hormuz suddenly raised fears that the United States was sliding into another open-ended Middle East conflict. Oil markets reacted immediately. Global shipping routes went on alert. Military analysts started warning about escalation. And right in the middle of that growing crisis, the White House made a move that left Pentagon officials stunned. President Trump announced plans to pull thousands of American troops out of Germany. At first glance, some Americans probably shrugged. Germany is not Iran. Germany is not the battlefield. So why does it matter? But military planners understood the danger instantly. Germany is one of the most critical logistical hubs for the entire U.S. military presence overseas. It is where troops rotate through. It is where wounded soldiers are treated and evacuated. It is where supply lines are coordinated for operations across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. When tensions explode in the Middle East, Germany becomes one of the central support systems keeping American operations alive. And now, in the middle of rising conflict with Iran, the administration suddenly wants to weaken that system. Critics inside Washington were reportedly blindsided. Pentagon officials allegedly had little warning. Military analysts began asking the same question over and over again. Why now? And this is where things become deeply unsettling. Because many people remembered this exact pattern from Trump's first term. Back in 2020, Trump abruptly pushed to withdraw thousands of U.S. troops from Germany. The announcement shocked military leadership at the time. Officials struggled to explain the strategic logic behind it. Then, reporters discovered something very interesting. The decision came shortly after conversations with Vladimir Putin. Now here we are again. Another major call with Putin. Another sudden push to reduce the American military footprint in Germany. Another decision that appears to directly benefit Moscow's long-term strategic goals. And critics are no longer treating this as coincidence. Because from the Kremlin's perspective, weakening America's military presence in Europe is practically a geopolitical dream scenario. Russia has wanted NATO weakened for decades. It wants Europe less protected. It wants American influence reduced. And somehow, according to critics, every time Trump speaks with Putin, policies emerge that seem to move in exactly that direction. Every single time. That perception is becoming politically radioactive. especially now that America is already stretched thin with rising instability overseas. Military experts have repeatedly warned that global adversaries watch moments like this very carefully. China watches. Iran watches. Russia watches. Terror networks watch. When America looks divided, distracted, and strategically confused, rivals become bolder. And many critics argue that is exactly what the world is seeing right now. An administration fighting judges at home, firing officials across the government, struggling with collapsing approval ratings, and simultaneously making military decisions that even some allies cannot understand. European leaders are reportedly growing nervous. NATO partners are increasingly uncertain. And America's global image as a stable superpower is taking visible damage. But here is the bigger problem. Foreign policy chaos eventually comes back home. Higher energy prices, more instability, more military spending, more global uncertainty. Americans have seen this movie before, and many of them know how expensive it becomes. But what shocked critics even more was what started happening inside America itself. As explosive as the legal scandals were, and as dangerous as the foreign policy chaos had become, critics say the most controversial battle of all was happening inside the United States itself, because what started as political rhetoric was now turning into something far more serious. A growing number of civil rights groups, legal organizations, and political analysts were beginning to accuse the administration of carrying out a systematic campaign targeting Black Americans and dismantling decades of civil rights protections. And for millions of people watching this unfold, the historical parallels were impossible to ignore. It started almost immediately after Trump returned to power. Executive orders targeting diversity initiatives, federal programs rewritten or dismantled, pressure campaigns against universities, corporations, and government agencies that promoted DEI policies. Supporters called it restoring merit. Critics called it something much darker. Then came the firings. One by one, high-profile Black officials across the federal government were suddenly removed, sidelined, or pushed out. Military leadership, transportation officials, education officials, energy regulators, labor board members. The pattern became impossible for opponents to ignore. And this is where things became truly explosive, because critics argued this was not simply political house cleaning. They believed it was ideological restructuring, an effort to reshape the federal government itself. Meanwhile, several anti-discrimination protections that had existed for decades were quietly rolled back. One executive order dating back to the 1960s had long prohibited federal contractors from discriminating based on race, religion, sex, or national origin. The administration rescinded it. Another federal contract clause banning segregated facilities was also removed. That decision stunned legal experts and civil rights advocates alike, because regardless of how the administration explained it, critics immediately asked the obvious question. Why would any modern White House remove explicit anti-segregation language from federal rules at all? Even some moderate observers struggled to understand the political logic. And then the economic numbers started moving in the wrong direction. Black unemployment began rising sharply after previously hitting historic lows. Federal agencies with large Black workforces reportedly faced some of the deepest staffing cuts during government downsizing efforts. Civil rights organizations warned that the country was watching the federal workforce roll backward in ways not seen for generations. But here is where things become even more dangerous politically. The battle was no longer just about jobs or executive orders. It became about voting power itself. After a major Supreme Court ruling weakened key parts of the Voting Rights Act, Republican-controlled states across the South immediately began redrawing congressional maps. Louisiana, South Carolina, Tennessee. District boundaries shifted. Minority voting influence weakened. Majority Black districts suddenly faced elimination or fragmentation. Critics warned this was the most aggressive rollback of minority political representation in decades. Some even compared it to the aftermath of Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War when Southern states systematically dismantled Black political power through legal manipulation. And for many Americans, that comparison hit like a thunderbolt, because Reconstruction is one of the darkest chapters in American political history. It was the era when promises of equality were slowly crushed through voter suppression, intimidation, gerrymandering, and institutional control. Now, critics say echoes of that period are returning. Critics say America is not moving forward anymore. It is moving backward at full speed. And politically, the consequences could be enormous, because demographics are changing. Young voters are watching. Minority communities are mobilizing. And every controversial decision is adding more fuel to an already explosive national debate. Even some people who are not particularly ideological are beginning to ask, how far can a government push before the backlash becomes uncontrollable? Because across the country, resistance was already starting to form. Church groups, voting rights organizations, civil liberties lawyers, grassroots coalitions, and that is where the resistance finally began. What happened next may end up becoming one of the most important political turning points of this era. Because after months of outrage, lawsuits, protests, and accusations, resistance to the administration stopped being isolated. It started organizing, not just inside Washington, not just among politicians, but inside churches, inside community groups, inside state legislatures, inside ordinary neighborhoods across America. And suddenly, the White House was facing something much harder to control than media criticism. A coordinated backlash. One of the clearest examples emerged in the Northeast, where faith leaders launched an aggressive financial campaign against a major bank accused of helping fund private immigration detention centers tied to ICE operations. At first, the protests looked small. A few rallies, some speeches, a handful of activists outside shareholder meetings, but then things escalated. Religious organizations began pulling their money out of the bank. Not symbolic amounts, millions of dollars. Pastors, rabbis, church coalitions, interfaith organizations. They publicly accused the bank of profiting from what they described as an expanding deportation machine. And the imagery was powerful. Clergy members walking into bank branches carrying giant withdrawal slips. Ministers standing at podiums declaring that people of conscience would not allow their money to support detention systems they viewed as immoral. What made this especially dangerous politically was the symbolism. Because historically in America, once churches begin openly mobilizing against a government policy, broader social movements often follow. Civil rights leaders understood that in the 1960s. Anti-war activists understood it during Vietnam. And now many organizers believe the same dynamic may be emerging again. But the backlash did not stop there. Voting rights groups launched lawsuits almost immediately after southern states moved to redraw congressional maps following the Supreme Court decision weakening the Voting Rights Act. In Louisiana, chaos erupted after officials attempted to halt elections already underway in order to redraw districts. Critics called it an unprecedented power grab. Voters who had already cast ballots suddenly learned some elections might be delayed, altered, or thrown into confusion altogether. Civil rights attorneys raced into federal court demanding emergency intervention. And this is where things became shocking. Even election officials reportedly admitted the situation was becoming a nightmare. Confusion spread. Trust eroded. Anger intensified. Because once voters begin believing elections themselves are unstable, the legitimacy of the entire system comes under pressure. And many Americans now fear the country is moving into exactly that territory. A place where institutions no longer feel neutral. Where every court ruling becomes political warfare. Where every election becomes a legitimacy battle. Where every major national issue turns into a cultural civil war. At the same time, judges across the country have increasingly begun pushing back against executive overreach. In Washington, federal courts blocked attempts by the administration to seize control over public land and facilities without due process. In other states, judges warned federal agencies that acting first and asking forgiveness later would no longer be tolerated. The legal system itself was starting to show signs of open resistance. And politically, this may become the administration's biggest problem of all. Because history shows something very important. Governments can survive scandals. They can survive economic downturns. They can even survive wars. But once enough citizens stop trusting the institutions around them, the foundation underneath the entire system starts cracking. That is the real danger now facing America. This is no longer just a battle over one president. It is no longer just Republicans versus Democrats. It is becoming a fight over what kind of country the United States will be in the future. A constitutional republic? Or a system where raw political power overrides every institution standing in its way? And both sides clearly understand the stakes now. That is why the language keeps escalating. That is why the protests keep growing. That is why the lawsuits keep multiplying. That is why every election from now forward may feel existential. Because once a country starts losing trust in its institutions, history shows what comes next is never peaceful.